Before dawn the harbour lay under a thin grey mist, and Yusuf balanced a basket of flat loaves against his hip as he picked his way over the wet stones of Sinop Quay. The masts of the Ottoman squadron stood beyond the haze like a grove of winter trees. 12 years at sea had taught him every sound a ship made at anchor, the slap of water against a hull, the groan of cordage, the cough of a sailor waking cold. He no longer sailed, not since a splintered yard off Trebizond had left his left shoulder stiff in damp weather, but he still earned his bread carrying water, bread, tobacco, and letters to the men aboard. In November of 1853, there was work enough, for Osman Pasha's vessels had come into the harbour and waited there, their sides dark with rain, their guns run in, their crews idle and watchful while the war with Russia widened along the Black Sea coast. The town was full of rumour. Men at the coffeehouse argued over the campaigns in the Caucasus and over whether the Russians dared come so far south in force. Some said the Sultan's fleet would soon move troops and supplies to the eastern shore. Some said the weather held them where they were. Yusuf heard all of it and believed none of it entirely. He knew only what his own eyes told him, frigates and corvettes lying in a curved line under the protection of the batteries, a few steamers among them, officers coming and going by boat, and marines stamping their feet against the cold. The smell of wet hemp, coal smoke, fish guts and tar hung over the harbour together. At the bakery oven, old Armenian Sarkis crossed himself before drawing out the bread and muttered that too many armed men made even bread rise poorly. That morning Yusuf rowed out first to a frigate where a boatswain's mate took the loaves with a joke about stale crusts and late pay. "If the Russians feed us shot instead of silver," the man said, "I will complain to them directly." The sailors laughed, because sailors always laughed where officers could not hear them, but Yusuf saw how quickly their eyes went back to the harbour mouth. On another vessel, he delivered 2 folded letters tied in blue thread to a marine sergeant who turned them over in his calloused hand as if they were warmer than gloves. Everywhere there were men patching clothing, scraping rust from hinges, mending lines no enemy was yet in sight to sever. The guns sat silent, heavy and waiting, and gulls settled on the water between the hulls as though no war had ever entered a bay. Near midday the mist thinned, the sea beyond the headlands darkened under a low sky, and a cry ran along the quay before Yusuf understood its meaning. Men pointed. Out past the harbour entrance, shapes emerged one by one from the pale distance, too regular to be fishing craft, too many for merchants. A boy beside Yusuf whispered, "Russian." By the time the signal guns and shouted orders broke the stillness, the whole town knew. Women gathered children from the shore, porters dropped sacks where they stood. From the ships came the shrill notes of pipes, the beat of feet on deck, and the thudding rush of gun crews hauling tackle into place. The Russian squadron did not remain an outline for long. It stood off the harbour in strength, line of battleships among them, and with them steam power enough to move with a certainty that sail alone could not give on such a day. Yusuf had seen great ships before, but never arranged with such deliberate menace. The Ottoman line answered as it could from anchor. He watched from behind a stone storehouse near the water, crouched with dock labourers and fishermen, while the batteries above prepared to join. Then the first broadside came. The sound did not resemble thunder, as poets like to say. It was harder, closer, a tearing blow that struck chest and ears together. White smoke burst from the enemy line, and moments later the harbour answered with its own flame and crashing report. For a little while Yusuf could still distinguish one vessel from another. He saw masts outlined through smoke, signal flags snapping briefly before vanishing, boats adrift and overturned. Shot smashed the water into pillars, splinters flew from struck hulls in pale showers more deadly than knives. The anchored Ottoman ships fought where they lay, and the Russian fire came steadily, methodically, as if the harbour itself were being dismantled plank by plank. When one corvette caught fire aft, the flames seemed at first no more than a galley accident, a sudden orange flutter against wet wood. Then the wind fed it. Fire climbed the rigging with a speed that made men shout in disbelief. Soon another vessel was burning, and another. Smoke thickened over the bay until day became copper-colored and uncertain. Someone cried that the wounded were being brought ashore. Yusuf ran because running was easier than watching. At the landing place, 2 sailors hauled in a boat half swamped with blood and water. One man had lost the use of his legs, another his face to splinters. Yusuf and a tanner's apprentice carried them to a warehouse, while an imam and a Greek physician worked side by side without speaking of doctrine. Outside, guns still beat at the town and ships alike. Windows burst inward, roof tiles skipped across the street. Every few moments the warehouse boards trembled and dust sifted from the beams. A marine no older than 20 seized Yusuf's sleeve and gasped, "My brother is on the Nuzinier." Yusuf said the only thing there was to say, "God is great." The young man turned his head to the wall and wept without sound. By afternoon the harbour was a furnace, fire reached magazines. Explosions rolled across the water and struck the town like physical blows. Men who had hidden inland crept back toward the shore and stopped there, unable to do anything but stare. The Ottoman squadron, trapped at anchor under overwhelming bombardment, was being destroyed before them. Great ships heeled, burned, drifted, or blew apart amid wreckage and floating spars. The batteries fired where they could, but smoke and ruin swallowed aim and order together. One Russian shell struck near the customs house and showered the quay with stone. Yusuf threw himself flat and tasted grit between his teeth. When he rose, his basket from the morning still lay near a bollard, one loaf blackened, another torn open and soaked through with harbour water. By the time the firing slackened, darkness had already begun to gather at the edge of the sky. The Russian ships remained beyond the wreck and flame, their work nearly finished. Of the Ottoman vessels, few shapes remained whole enough for a seaman's eye to name confidently. Boats moved among the debris seeking survivors. Cries came over the water, some for help, some for mothers, some in no language pain would permit Yusuf to understand. He helped drag a man ashore whose hands were burned so badly that the skin had tightened over the fingers like parchment over sticks. "Water?" the man whispered. Yusuf held a cup to his mouth. "Which ship?" he asked, though he did not know why. The sailor swallowed with difficulty and said only, "Gone." That night Sinop did not sleep. The town glowed red where ships still burned in the harbour, and sparks drifted over the roofs like a swarm of embers from some giant brazier. Families went from mosque to warehouse to shoreline, seeking sons and husbands. The dead were laid in rows wherever there was dry ground enough. Yusuf found Sarkis, the baker, carrying bandages torn from flour sacks. Neither man spoke of the old quarrels that usually separated neighbors in ordinary times. They worked by lantern light until their hands shook from cold and labor. Far out on the water, black hulks smoldered and occasionally collapsed inward with a hiss. The smell was tar, salt, powder, wet ash, and the sickening sweetness of burned timber and flesh together. Near morning, when the worst of the flames had sunk into a low red smolder, Yusuf stood again at the quay where he had walked in the mist only a day before. The harbour seemed larger now, emptied by destruction. Broken yards floated among casks and fragments of carved stonework. A cap, a child's size perhaps, bobbed against the stones and drifted away before he could reach it. Men were already counting losses, naming ships, speaking of commanders, of how many had died, of how the news would carry beyond the Black Sea to capitals Yusuf would never see. He understood none of the diplomacy that would follow, only that a fleet had entered Sinop harbour under one sky and by the next dawn had become wreckage. He bent, picked up a scorched loaf from beside the bollard, and crumbled it into the water. Gulls descended at once, fighting over what remained.